Good afternoon, everybody. This is Gary from Vigilant Software. Some of you may know me from previous webinars or demonstrations of the product, as well as obviously through our support channels as well. The meeting is now going to be starting. It shall last for approximately another hour and 15 minutes. The presentation part of the webinar this afternoon is approximately just over an hour, and then we'll conclude with a couple of questions that would have been presented throughout the demonstration today. When you submit a question, if you could try and make it as specific to the area that we are working on at that moment in time, so that when I'm coming back to them after the presentation part of it, then obviously we can ensure that we are answering it correctly and how you wish for it to be covered as well. Please note that any questions that we can't answer whilst we're on the webinar, be that through time constraints or simply a limitation of my knowledge, and obviously please do be assured that we'll come back to you straight away afterwards with the question where possible. For anybody that is wishing to have a copy of this webinar, they are recorded during the actual webinar itself, so everything we're going through at the moment will be recorded. We'll also try and incorporate any questions that are presented to obviously make the recording a little bit more relevant or specific to today's webinar. And then there'll be a pack that will be sent out within 24 to 48 hours of the webinar concluding this afternoon. There's a couple of people in the attendees list that I have spoken to before, and there's a couple of new faces as well. Now, the webinars are relatively running along the same path as they do on a monthly basis. The webinars are typically for either people wanting a refresher to the tool or simply are new to it or even looking to purchase it in the future. If there's anybody on here that has been using the tool, that's great. That way we can obviously try and cover some more in-depth questions from people that have been using it, which then obviously might assist with the other attendees as well. So to begin with, we're just going to go through a couple of slides. Essentially, a lot of it is just an introduction to vsRisk and Vigilant Software ourselves, and then we'll move on into the actual usability of the product as well. You may notice a small lag between me speaking and what you see on the screen, and that's purely because we run our vsRisk installs on a virtual machine, so that's also another environment that you could also use your side as well if you wanted to keep it off of your domain for whatever reason. So we'll get started. Provided you can all see my screen, it should be showing you the Vigilant software, and I'll see who this is being presented by this afternoon. So we're going to start running through some of the slides, and then, like I mentioned, we'll move on into the platform itself. So part of today's discussion, we're going to cover off an introduction, as I mentioned, to ourselves and Vigilant Software vsRisk itself. We're then going to go through an ISMS creation. We're then going to cover off a basic risk assessment to begin with using our sample company. Then we're going to cover off any control review selections, reports in the dashboard, and then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to go through a Q&A towards the end as well. So an introduction, vsRisk was developed to be an information security risk assessment tool created originally by ISO 27001 experts. Whilst we still consult them, we've now moved on into more of the software development side of the platform, be that locally installed or a multi-user platform. It is a desktop tool that allows you to conduct an information security risk assessment both quickly and easily, and it is, as I mentioned, fully aligned with ISO 27001 2013. Some of you may already know that there are two flavors that vsRisk comes in. We have standalone, which would be for a sole project owner within an organization that will have it installed on their one machine, and then they will conduct the entire risk assessment themselves. And then we have our multi-user platform, which will obviously help cover businesses of all sizes. So you can actually start to include some of the risk owners and asset owners, not just one project owner having to bear the entire weight of the risk assessment on their shoulders. So we'll go through ISMS creation in just a second. So the ISMS creation, it's the scope of information security management system defines the bounds of the risk assessment. So essentially what is going to be incorporated in the risk assessment itself. Within vsRisk, you can create multiple ISMSs, each of which will be subject to a different risk assessment. The reason why we've done that is not only do we sell obviously directly to an end user, we do also sell to consulting firms as well. And the purpose of having multiple ISMS accounts on there is so that obviously they can keep their individual clients separate without the risk assessments either impeding on each other or any of the report version numbers causing any conflict as well. And obviously we'll cover that in a bit more detail in just a second. vsRisk does come packaged with the sample ISMS, which is the one that some of you may already be familiar with, but also the one that we're going to be running on today. It's essentially something that you can use as a template for your own risk assessment, or alternatively, you could use it as essentially a playground, so you can get familiarized with the tool before then going through and committing to the work that you're going to be putting into your own ISMS. So the sample company ISMS, as I mentioned, it is a template moving forward. So it does contain a library of assets that have been assigned to appropriate organizational roles. The logical threat vulnerability combinations that have been associated with each group, and finally the relevant controls from Annex A of ISO 27001 have been applied to each threat and vulnerability combination as well. So whilst you can make a direct copy of the sample company, you may want to also make small modifications to fit your organization as well. So we're going to switch over to our virtual machine just now. So you should now be able to see this on your screen. I'm just going to double check to make sure we don't keep going without it. Okay, there we go. So this is vsRisk in a nutshell. So this will be what it looks like to whether you're a multi-user of the platform or whether you're going to be using it as a standalone platform. The version we have installed is standalone, and we'll cover off the differences between them. Essentially, the functionality of the tool for both is exactly the same. There's just simple small areas within the settings menus that differentiate between a consultant's edition, standalone, and also the multi-user platform as well. So to begin with, as the slides I just mentioned, we're going to go through and create a new ISMS from scratch. So whilst we have the sample company, which is going to be already included within vsRisk, you've then got the option to add one additional ISMS to the platform itself. So we select on here and it will open up a new screen where it'll ask you to start compiling the relevant information to your business. So the first section you're going to need to fill in is obviously your organization name. We're just going to keep it nice and simple and leave it as ourselves. And then the ISMS name can either be exactly the same, or if you're maybe a larger organization where you'll have the organization itself be Vigilant Software, but then you may have separate ISMSs within your business that you may want to keep separate, and obviously then they'll have their own ISMS names as well. So we'll just leave that as is. The lead assessor name we're going to set to be me this afternoon, and my email address we're just going to make one up because it's not going to be linked to any form of Active Directory again because of that virtual machine setup. If you do have access to a Active Directory or you do wish to tie in integrated security, there's always that option if you're using it on a domained PC or laptop, and then once you've done that it will automatically pick up this information for you. If you're not having that turned on, you will be asked to set up a username, so we're just going to leave it as demo for this afternoon, and then you'll be asked to create your own password. Now with vsRisk itself, this is something that we would strongly recommend you making a note of this outside of the platform. If you do forget the password, it does require you to contact support, and then we essentially reset it for you through a system tool that we have our side. So we're going to select next on here, and then it will ask you now to choose the appropriate control sets that you're going to be working with. Now, if you're going to be using this as a multi-user platform and you know you're only going to be working on ISO 27001, this will be your best opportunity to remove any of the non-required control sets to obviously prevent them being used by mistake by other users. So if we just go through, we can deselect or select the ones we want, and it doesn't matter if you turn them off now and you may require it later on in your project. You can always toggle these back on under the settings menu, and only administrators of the tool can do that. So again, it's going to try and cut down on people that don't have that sort of level of access making these sort of significant changes. We're going to select next, and this will then take you into your management scales. So as you'd expect, you'll have your likelihood and impact areas. The top one is going to be based on qualitative to begin with. So we've got almost impossible ranging all the way through to almost certain. And then finally below there, you've got impact. And at the moment, vsRisk will assign this simply to be operational. So less than 1 day, 1 to 3 days, etc. You can, of course, add on your own additional context. So if you want to add on one to impact, for example, simply select the add context area, give the new impact its description. So you may want to add in something like financial. That's normally quite a common one, and also reputational as well, and then obviously how you choose to score that within your business. So we're just going to delete this off of here. And then we're going to select next, and this will take us into the final setup stage of the ISMS creation, which is ultimately going to be your acceptance criteria. So on the left-hand side, we have simply two at the moment. We have only acceptable and unacceptable. These can be modified, so if we need to add on additional criteria, simply select yes, we wish to add a new one, add a new criteria. It will then create this here, select on new criteria, and then we can enter in the relevant category. So if we use something like disaster or whatever is going to be best suited to your own risk assessment. To help you differentiate it from the rest of the grid, we can give it its new colouring, and then obviously we can modify its range as well as to how much of this set criteria score that we're going to be using. Now, if you're an organisation that doesn't use a risk calculation formula, you can always toggle this off, but we'll cover that off during the settings section of vsRisk as well. So we're going to leave it toggled on for now, and then once we're happy with all of this, we simply select finish. It will return us back to the home page, and then we'll see our ISMS built, and then this will be stored either on your SQL-based database or on your locally stored one, so that'll be on your primary drive for your laptop or PC. If we were to switch over to this now, it will ask you to then log in, and this will do this each time you flick between each of the ISMS accounts. Obviously, most businesses will only have the one, but if you're a client, you will need to have separate username and passwords for each one, just to keep, just to add that extra level of security. So we're going to go through here, enter in our username and then our password, and then it will say welcome Gary, and we can start working on this ISMS if we wanted to. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to cover off our sample company. That's what we're going to be using today, as it's been built to almost a completed state. It would simply require you to go through and score based on your risk calculation and also your impact and likelihood scales. So switching back to our PowerPoint presentation now, we're going to go through the risk assessment itself. So just to cover off some of the, I suppose, salesy speech for vsRisk. vsRisk has essentially been developed to deliver simple, fast, accurate and hassle-free risk assessments, obviously moving away from those more complex and sometimes hard to maintain spreadsheet, and it will also be able to produce consistent, robust and reliable risk assessments year after year, be that whether you're modifying your scales or simply rerunning the same risk time and time again. So the key features of version 3 over 2.6, if there's anybody in the attendees that is currently still running on one of the older versions that we had essentially set as end of life as of April. Some of the new features, we've now got a custom acceptance criteria, which is what we just covered off during that ISMS creation. So this, just to recap, users can create criteria for particular likelihood and impact combinations. This gives risk assessors greater control to build a more sophisticated risk assessment. Risk Assessment Wizard, this is actually something that we're going to demonstrate this afternoon, and it's essentially just an 8-step guide. So as opposed to going through manually picking out your threats and vulnerabilities and then your controls, this will just guide you through. So it'll ask you first of all to pick your asset, your threats, your vulnerabilities, and then how you're going to mitigate that risk. We've then got control set synchronization. So this is where it ties into our cyber comply portal, which is another side of Vigilance portfolio, where we deal with more of the GDPR side of maybe like a compliancy or data flow mapping, for example. That's a free of charge area of the tool. It doesn't cost you anything, and it's very quick and simple, and we'll show you how to do that as well. And then finally, risk assessments at a glance. So we have our dashboard. The dashboard is a form over function area, and it simply just gives you a top level view as to how you're coming along with the project overall. Maybe you want to share that with stakeholders or senior management from within your business. So the control reviews, we're going to go through that now, and we can do this within vsRisk. And then we'll cover off going through and running a risk assessment based on what we'd set up in the controls viewer. So we're going to switch back now to our vsRisk platform. So the area that this was just referring to is our control or our review control selection. So we'll select on here, and it will open up all of the control sets that vsRisk has available to it. As you saw earlier during the ISMS creation, there are 8 sets, things like NIST, ISO, CES, PCI, etc. When we come into this screen, it'll obviously automatically load you onto your desired or required control set. So obviously we've instantly gone straight into 27001 as that's what the sample company is defaulted to. If you do, you can go back through each one of these. So if you wanted to go into PCI DSS, for example, you can switch between those as well. Now, if we look at our top one here, so A5.1.1 policies for information security, we can see that it's automatically been selected and it's already being used within the sample company itself. So we can't actually untick this because it is part of the risk assessment. The next box down is where you could choose to exclude a control for whatever reason. Now, again, this is going to be grayed out purely because it's already being used on the sample company in conjunction with a threat of vulnerability. So we can see here the related risks applied to risk business disasters, e.g. financial collapse, etc. The last 5 boxes down here, things like business requirements, statutory, legal, regulatory, these are just optional boxes that you may wish to tick and then obviously pop in here in your description box the reason why that control is having to be put into place or implemented to obviously maintain a business requirement, contractor requirement, etc. Finally, below there, you'll have a chance to input your own implementation details, so how you're actually implementing this individual control into your organization. And then finally, below there, you'll have your documentation list. Now, these documents can be imported if you are the owner of a IT governance ISO 27001 documentation toolkit. That has the ability to be imported in bulk, so all of the implementation guidance, requirements, and so on, that can be imported, and that's what you can see here, these two. Alternatively, if you have your own implementation supporting documents or any documents you wish to link to a particular control, they can also be added into this section. Just simply select on the plus button and it will ask you to give it its overall name, how it's going to be displayed within the tool, and then finally you can browse any local storage or URL location, maybe a SharePoint location. So that is the review control selection. So again, we're just going to switch back to our trustee presentation. So the control reviews. So the control selection, as we just covered off, it allows you to check and view the controls that have been selected as a result of the risk assessment. So that was the grey area that I can actually deselect because it's already being used in conjunction with our sample company. We've then got the ability to exclude controls or indicate further controls that have been implemented, satisfy contractual, business, statutory, regulatory and legal requirements. So those are those 5 extra boxes, and then followed by the description, and then all data entered into the controls viewer is incorporated into the statement of applicability, again an area that we're going to cover off during today's presentation. So we're going to switch back now and we're going to go through the actual risk assessment stage, which will then give us a better visible representation when we look at the dashboard, any of the reports, and then finally we'll cover off in the settings menu where you can make further modifications to your ISMS. So we're going to select on Assess risk now, and this will open up a new page in just a second, and it will obviously be pre-populated with things like asset owners. You can also switch into groups if you so wish to, etc. So we're going to open up on this page now, and by default you'll be able to see that all of these are viewed by owner. So as we saw earlier, the sample company is built with its predefined asset owners, and each one will have their predefined assets and associated risks to those as well. At the top here, if you choose to view this separately, or if you're going to be applying certain risks to an entire group of assets, we can view by group. So if you want to do it by building, sensitive information, so obviously if you wanted just to assign in a risk to building, maybe it's flooding, things like that, then you've got that option as well. The next option down is if you want to view them on a very granular level, so the individual assets by themselves without causing any confusion with who actually the asset owner is or anything like that. You can view it that way around. And then finally, we can do a scenario-based risk assessment if you choose to, and that's this final option here. So we're going to go back to owner. Along the top here, you've got a section where you can jump into user management. We're going to cover that when we go into the settings. We've then got options here to add new assets at this stage. So whilst we have the ability within vsRisk to import a large asset register previously used maybe from Excel documents, etc., you can also add them in here. You can remove assets if you choose to. So if we were to select on our CIO here, we could go down to removable media, for example, and we can see that there have been some risks assigned to this. They're obviously just awaiting their scoring. We can remove that asset, and obviously it will then give you a pre-warning that all of the attached threats, vulnerabilities, controls, and child assets will also be deleted. On the note of child assets, whilst you might have laptops, mobile telecoms, anything like that, or desktops, you may have certain assets within those groups that may have individual risks that apply to them. So whilst you may have a team, maybe everyone in your organization is just given a laptop as standard, that's their basic workstation. Now, for the majority of the users that are purely office-based, they will only be using it in the office, and they will not be allowed to either remove it from the office, take it home, or anything like that. So obviously they're not going to have the same risks assigned to them as somebody maybe like a sales manager that's having to do site visits, or will periodically work from home, or even on trains, things like that. They're going to have their own risks applied to them. So if you were to choose laptops as that prime example, we can select on the plus button at the top here to add a new asset, and then that will create the child group or the child asset below there, where you'll be asked to give it its name, who the owner of the asset is, and so on. So we're going to come out of here. We're going to leave it as new asset for today, or we could just simply choose to remove the newly created asset from the asset library. So as we mentioned, from this screen, what we're going to go through today is the Risk Wizard. So it is the new feature within vsRisk 3. So if you are on this training webinar and you're using 2.6, this feature simply won't be available to you. So we're going to jump into our risk assessment now. So bear me 2 seconds. Okay, so we'll try that again. We'll go into our Risk Wizard. Okay, so now that we are in the Risk Wizard, we're going to go through and obviously just go through the 8 steps that it mentions in the presentation itself. So the first section you're going to be asked to go through is the asset selection stage. So all of these have been pre-configured with the sample company. Yours either will look exactly like this if you're choosing to make a carbon copy of the sample organization, or yours will look obviously a lot more specific to yourself. Now, the 2 options that we have here, I mean, typically we go through laptops. It's a very standardized option. It's one that we tend to cover during demonstrations. Also, we can go through any of the other ones, such as maybe air conditioning units, server rooms, and so on. So we're going to use server room. At the top here, we can then see the type. So it's a service within our business, who the owner of that's going to be. So in this case, it's still our CIO. The classification, this is something you would set up within your own ISMS, and then any additional information if you choose to add that in, such as identification. So we revert back to the server room. You may have individual server ID numbers, and then find locations. Maybe they're located locally, or maybe they're located off-site, and you can make that a little bit more specific under that section. The next area we're going to move on into then is what is the threat to our server room. Now, obviously, a more popular one could be if it's a basement server room, it could be due to flooding. Or finally, at the top here, you could have something like air conditioning failure. We all know electronics don't work particularly well when they get particularly warm. The next section under here is then going to be what your vulnerability is going to be. So we could say, we searched in here, we could say that there could be power fluctuations, outages to area, so on and so forth. So we'll just choose this top one for today's example, and then we move on into what our initial risk is going to be. Now, the sample company, just to give you an idea of the scale that we're working with, the likelihood is 1 to 3. So we've got unlikely, likely, and very likely. And then on the grid on the left-hand side, the impact, that's going to be simply operational days. So as standard, we've set our requirement that we actually have to go through and score each one of these individually. So the confidentiality, availability, and integrity. If we toggle off one of these, so we're actually going to choose not to score maybe confidentiality or one of the other 2, you'll then see that also automatically turns off the residual risk score, because you can't be expected to do an after treatment score if there isn't one beforehand. We're going to leave them all toggled on for now, and we're going to set them all to be in the unacceptable area, like so. And once we're happy with this, we then move on into what our response is going to be. Now, for people that have been familiar with ISO for some time, this used to be where you'd see the 4T, so treat, terminate, tolerate, and transfer. The new wording that is now going to be used moving forward will be modify, share, retain, and avoid. And just to help you understand which one that relates to, we've put a brief description underneath each. So we're going to choose to either modify this, so we're going to treat it in-house. We could share this, so obviously that would be involving maybe getting the electrical company involved or something like that. We could choose to avoid it, which obviously would not be advised at all, or simply we're going to retain the risk and tolerate it if it just happens and accept that it is a likely thing to happen in that location. So we're going to choose to share it in today's example, and then we could just say, I don't know, emergency line, emergency call out to power company. Once we're happy with our response, we're then going to select next on here, and then this will give us the last opportunity to go through and choose our risk owner. So this is going to be either it's still going to be the CIO, it could move now onto the facilities manager with it now being a service, so it's going to be the air conditioning failure. We're going to leave it as our sample, as our CIO, and then finally below there you'll have comments. Now what you may have noticed is the number of options on here have now been reduced, and that's purely because if we're choosing to share the risk or transfer it to somebody else, therefore we don't have our own controls in place to obviously mitigate the risk. And subsequently, we obviously then don't have an after treatment score either. So we're going to select finish at this point. It will then return us back to our risk assessment page, and then we would then expand on our CIO, navigate to server room, and then we'll be able to see our newly set up risk just here. Now the different colors here, so if we were to say that we were going to choose to treat or modify the risk, that would be green, and so on and so forth. If we select on here, this will just give you the information that we've just created, so air conditioning failure due to power fluctuations, outages to the area. If we want to make modifications to this, we can either jump back into that risk wizard that we just covered off, or we can select on the edit option, and that will bring you into a right hand side attributes panel. Now as standard, we've got ours set to be picking threat and vulnerability separately, or we can toggle this off, and then we can choose from a relatively extensive drop-down list if you wanted to. We can make changes to who the risk owner is going to be, so if you're actually moving this risk from one owner to another, it's quite quick and simple to do. We've then got the compromises to that particular risk. So if we now want to turn off confidentiality, it doesn't actually have any sort of impact or compromises on that, or integrity or availability, you can do this in here. We can make quick changes to the scoring if you wanted to. We can then see the risk rating. Now, obviously, this is going to be based on our risk calculation that we've got pre-configured for the sample company. And then finally, if we're going to make a modification to the risk response, that can also be actioned down here as well. So if we come off of there and we move on to one that we know will have controls in place. So if we now look at the server room, unauthorized access to facilities due to inadequate control access to server rooms. Now this has been built to a certain degree, as we mentioned. We're choosing to modify or treat the risk. However, there's not been any scoring done to this just now. So we select on this button here, we can go through and say, okay, beforehand, the likelihood is going to be 3, and then we can give it an after treatment score as well. If we want to go into the nitty-gritty and start scoring the individual confidentiality, integrity, and availability, you can either do that by going back into the risk wizard, or we can open up the right-hand side attributes panel as well. Now, if you were running your risk on the server room, for example, and you've applied controls, you can always add additional controls after the fact. So if you've gone through the risk wizard and you want to add more on at a later stage, you can always do that. You can remove them at this point. And then furthermore, if you select on the individual control and move forward into the next screen, this will then give you access to where you're going to be marking if that control has been implemented, yes or no. If it hasn't, when is the implementation planned for? You'll be able to leave comments at this section as well, and we actually have a report that can run a comments report. We've then got a section here which will then move back to that supporting documents that we looked at under the review control selection. Now, something to note on here, if you do import the toolkit from IT governance, once it has been imported, you cannot remove them from this section. So they are just going to be essentially hardwired into vsRisk itself. Now, if you have supporting documents that is relevant to this control, but only specifically to this risk, you can add it over here on the right-hand side. So that'll be your own custom supporting documents, but it'll only be visible on this one. So next time you come to use, in this case, physical security perimeter A11.1.1, that same supporting document won't be available to you. So that, in short, is the risk assessment, the risk scenarios, etc. So at the top here, if we wanted to go back through a scenario based, I've just seen that at the corner of my eye. So if we come into here, we've then got our scenario-based risks. Again, we've got that risk wizard again. So if we wanted to run through a scenario-based risk assessment, we can do so at this point. Now, with regards to how you would conduct that, obviously being a software developer, I'm not probably best qualified to answer that question, but obviously I can find out for you and come back directly if that's perfectly okay with you. Let me just double check to see who this was. Okay. Yes, Peter, we'll come back to you after the meeting today, and obviously we'll just discuss that in a little bit more detail if that's okay. So we'll come out of the risk assessment screens now, and we're going to cover off into another section. So now that we've gone through and started populating our risk assessments with some actual tangible data, we're going to have a quick look at the dashboard. So if you recall earlier, I did mention the dashboard itself is simply there as a top level view of how the risk assessment is coming along. So this isn't something you're going to be submitting to auditors. It's purely if you wanted to keep track internally, if you wanted to export it, or even just use it in a presentation environment when you're in a meeting with stakeholders, senior management, and so on. So once this is finished preparing itself, there'll be a number of key elements on here which will just highlight or outline not only the top risks within the business, and the space that you'll see at the top of the screen in just a second will display up to 8 of the top risks within the business. You'll then see on the left-hand side, we'll be able to see our risks by rating, so we can see how many are going to be outside acceptance, how many are within acceptance criteria, and how many have simply not been assessed yet. Now, because the sample company already has the risks in place but not the score, obviously a lot of this is going to be, for better words, a grey area, but obviously that will be changed over time. If you want to change to view the number of risks by owners, you can see who is the predominant owner of the majority of the risk within your business. We've got that option available to you. Down here, we can view the control status. So currently we're only working with ISO 27001-2013. We can see how much of the particular control set we're implementing, how much we're choosing to exclude, how many are planned, and how many are selected. On the back of that, if you are working on multiple control sets at any given point, you can bounce in between them. We can also just simply select all, so you can view how much of each of them you're actually implementing into your business. The next stage on here is going to be your timeline. So the timeline is a very, very basic risk treatment plan for better words. So it's simply just going to give you an indication as to when certain controls are either overdue, and it will give you a date as to when this was due to be put into place simply by hovering over how long it is overdue by. This would obviously be a lot more relevant if you are working on your own risk assessment. The next tab on here is going to show you a very top level audit trail to let you know who has logged on and obviously how long they are logged on for. The next stage over here is the risk response. Now, whilst in an earlier stage we referred to this as modify, share, retain and avoid, at this stage we kind of revert back to the risk response itself, so treat, terminate, tolerate or transfer. At the top here, we've then got summary. So we've got the number of risks that currently exist within the business, how many of the controls within ISO 27001 we have selected, the number of total assets within the organization, the number of asset owners, risk owners, and finally the number of risks that we have treated. And then finally, as I mentioned a second ago, you've got that top area where it will outline some of the more critical areas of the business. Next to each one of these areas, we can see a question mark. Hovering over this will just give you an indication as to what that particular area does. And then finally, if you do want to export it into PDF and share, then you can do that option at the top here as well. So we'll close out of here. We will come back now to our PowerPoint just to cover off some of the next parts of the presentation this afternoon. So the reports, which is the next area we're going to look at, is it's a comprehensive overview of the current state of your risk assessment and treatment process. It can generate up to 6 types of report, so 2 of which The statement of applicability and the risk treatment plan are mandatory for ISO 27001. They're the two that we're going to have a look at this afternoon, and obviously the reports can be printed, exported, and so on, and that's something we'll cover off in just a second as well. With regards to the statement of applicability and the risk treatment plans, we can obviously share with you the sample company ones if you're either looking to purchase and you want to see what these reports look like, or if obviously you're a new user and you want to have a better understanding of what they are likely to look like after you've completed your work. So before we move on to the Q&A, we'll go back into the reports and we'll cover off some more of the in-depth settings areas. So looking at the reports themselves, now the reason why we only covered two is obviously they are the two more relevant ones to actually going through auditing and so on and so forth, but also due to the size of the sample company, these do take a little while to build, so we're conscious of time when we do these webinars. So these are the 6 that will be available to you. So you'll have your statement of applicability, your risk treatment plan, risk assessment report, risk summary report, comments report, and your control usage report as well. So the first one we're going to have a look at is the statement of applicability. Now, as I mentioned right at the very beginning of today's demonstration or webinar, these can be version controlled. So if you are a consultant, for example, who has multiple ISMS accounts, each one of these would be kept separate. So if we were on company A's ISMS and we're on version 1.6 of that particular report, if we then went to company A and ran that same statement of applicability, it won't then suddenly show version 1.7. It would keep it on its own counter, so to speak. Down the bottom here, you've got options to export. So we did mention earlier that you'll have the ability to export it into PDF. So it is simply, once you've gone through your risk assessment, you run the statement of applicability, and then that is ready to be handed straight over to the auditing board. The reports themselves are, in our minds, perfectly acceptable to be handed over. The reason why we can confidently say that is obviously during one of the earlier slides we did mention that we worked in conjunction with ISO 27001 consultants and auditors to ensure what this tool can produce is acceptable from their side. So looking at the top here, we've got filters. So if you are running multiple control sets, you've got the option to select or deselect at the top here. Excuse me. The next area down here is obviously going to outline exactly which organisation ISMS that you're referring to. So the ISMS in this case is going to be the sample company, organisation is the sample company as well. We've got our published date and time, we've got our version number, which is what I was just talking about just a second ago, and then finally who published this. Below there, you'll then have what you'd expect to see in your statement of applicability. So first of all, the actual control set you're working with, the control in question, and then obviously the the supporting documents that you're going to be using. So again, please be aware that any supporting documents you do add into the tool will be referenced inside the statement of applicability. Down the bottom here, touching on that export option again, you'll have PDF, XPS or Excel document exports, and you can also export raw data from this area as well. You can use the tool as a presentation area as well, so very much like you'd use PowerPoint. You've got the options down here, or if you just want to keep it nice and simple, you can print directly from vsRisk as well. So the next one we're going to have a quick look at is our risk treatment plan. The risk treatment plan has 2 additional filters added to it. So we've got the risk owner. So if we want to look at purely the CIO's risk treatment plan or the facilities manager, etc., we can narrow it down by there. And then finally, we can see the status of that as well, whether it's overdue, planned, or already currently being implemented. Each time you make a change at the top here, you will need to rebuild the report. Obviously, it's not going to be able to filter that straight out. You'd need to rebuild it from scratch, and then ultimately that will then give it its own version number, so you can keep them separate from one another again. Down the bottom, you'll have those same options available to you. Each one of these reports has that same functionality. Each one can be exported or printed or even presented within the tool itself. So we'll just give this a moment to finish compiling itself. Okay, so once the report itself has been finalized, again, you'll have at the top of the screen the name of the ISMS that you're running this against, and then finally you'll have the actual treatment plan itself. So the top one here, recovery of information from disposed media due to erasure issues when disposing or reusing media. We've chosen to modify this, and we can see that this control is currently overdue, and obviously that's going to be the case for pretty much every single control in the sample company moving forward due to when it was first created back in 2016. Yours will obviously be a lot more relevant, and if you want to be a lot more specific as to who you're running it against, again, you've got these filters at the top here, which will run through the individual asset owners, or risk owners, sorry, in this case, and then finally the status, whether they're planned, in place, or overdue. Now, the reports themselves, we're not going to go into too much detail on. The reason being is, whilst all of us in Vigilant software support team, we're all qualified to a foundation, or some of us are even at a implementation level of ISO, I wouldn't like to go into too much detail and obviously offer out false information based on the reports themselves. If you do have more in-depth questions, please do pop them over to us though, so that we can pull on some of our internal resources to get you a more accurate answer. So we're going to come out of the report section now, and we're going to finish off in the settings menu. Now the settings menu is going to look quite reminiscent of what we looked at right at the very beginning of the presentation today, which was the ISMS creation, and that's purely because we're not going to say, okay, you've now created that ISMS, that's it, it's set in stone, you cannot change it. Obviously over time you may be wishing to change your acceptance criteria, you may be wishing to change your impact and likelihood scales, control sets, availability, and so on. So the first area under system is going to be your acceptance criteria. So we looked at this earlier, so we won't spend too much time on that just now. Again, we've got the options to toggle on or off your risk calculation scores like so. The next one along is your impact and likelihood scale. So these can all be modified after the fact of creating the ISMS. Now, one thing we do need to warn you of at this point is if you do make a change to this, obviously you can naturally expect you're going to have to go back through and rescore all of your risks and so on. However, what this will do here is if you try and do it straight away, so if we just toggle this switch, it will just pre-warn you of that fact. So if you're not 100% sure, this will at least give you that small breathing room before making the final decision. Next area is again that control set selection area. We've then got an area where you can input or create your own classification types. Now, from a importing of a pre-existing asset register, this is something that you'll need to go through first before doing that. So, for example, you use these 5, however, you have your own additional classification types as well. Then you would need to go and select Edit, add your own classification types that match the asset register, so when it imports, it'll import seamlessly. If you don't do that beforehand, when you try and import the asset register, it will flag up an error message. Now the error message is normally quite descriptive. It will let you know exactly where it's failed. If not, pop it over to us and we'll be able to replicate and let you know exactly what's caused the issue. The next one along is the type. So again, this is something, again, you'll need to populate before importing an asset register. We've got the standard ones based on our sample company already included, but again, you've got the option to edit, so you can either remove or add in your own custom types to ensure that that import goes as straightforward as possible. The next one along is the risk calculation. So under the acceptance criteria we looked at earlier, you do have the option to toggle this on or off. It doesn't have to have any sort of impact onto your risk assessment. If, however, you do use a risk calculation, these are the 5 that will be available to you. So you'll have impact plus likelihood -1, impact plus likelihood, impact times likelihood, and so on. If you want to double check what these scorings will look like across the rest of your assessment, we've got an example area down here where you can just have a play around and see what these scores would look like. The next tab along is requirements. Now, requirements is something we would strongly recommend playing around with on the sample company before making your final decision for your configuration when you set up your own ISMS. The reason being, again, is if you do if you've created your risk assessment, you've gone through, you've scored it, so on and so forth, if you do make a change to a requirement, it would then require you to go back through and do that all over again. The reason being is the requirements that these options are do have impacts when it looks at maybe, so the top one, we've said, yes, we want to assess our impact to confidentiality, integrity, and availability separately. That was the 3 toggle switches we had earlier during the risk wizard. If you don't want that option and you want to just score it across all 3 of them, you can just set that to no. Making that change obviously would then require you to go back in and do so. The other options we've got here is the ability to assess a likelihood to affect confidentiality, integrity, and availability separately. So we've selected no, but obviously this will tie into the one at the very top. We can assess legal, contractual, regulatory requirements separately, or finally assess a residual risk on a per control basis, not just on the actual risk scenario itself. The last section on here is the import of a toolkit. So at the moment, very quick sales pitch, we are doing a bundle pack, which is either standalone or multi-user, which comes with the ISO 27001 toolkit and support for a 12-month period. So for anybody looking to purchase now, they're more than likely going to have the documentation toolkit included. All you'd simply need to do here is select on import. We can see in the background I've got some on our desktop already. I'm not going to do it because we've already done it here. There'll be a zip file in there, which is essentially just the entire Annex A. Select on there and it will import relatively quickly, and then you'll have these documents available to you at any given point. The next tab along is administration. Now there's two ways that you can look at administration here. If you're a standalone user, standalone users will use this area to either create asset owners, risk owners, etc. Now if you're running standalone on a shared machine, then obviously you can set individual users to have access. Obviously it's not normally the way that we see the tool being used, but that functionality is there. If, however, you're a multi-user client, and obviously this is how you're using vsRisk, if we selected on our CIO, for example, these are all going to be toggled off as standard, but this would be then where you can quickly search in your Active Directory for their logon information, so that when the client is then installed on their machine, it's a very simple login procedure for them. You've then got the option, if you are not using integrated security, you can force the user to change their password on the next login. You can modify their name under this section, their email address, and finally their role within the business as well. So under role, just to explain these in a bit more detail, administrator essentially gives that user full access to every single area of the tool. That will include the area we're currently looking at, any of the system tab in settings, and also the ability to run any report as and when they need to. Asset owner, that simply allows them to log into the risk assessment area and work on their own assigned assets. It doesn't allow them to come into too much detail into the settings menu. Consultant access is if you are working with an external body and you wish to grant them temporary access to the tool, you can do so. You're giving them the consultancy status. And then finally, revoked. Now, revoked is something we would strongly encourage you using where possible. The reason being is if you delete an asset owner, it will obviously then remove all of the assigned assets to that user or that owner, and then subsequently all the risks as well. If you don't want that to happen, maybe there's going to be a change of position in your organization, so the CIO is changing or leaving the organization. What you simply need to do is revoke their access. When somebody new has been appointed to the role, you would then set them up using either Active Directory or just simply giving them their login information, and then you just set them back up to their previous status, whether that be administrator, etc. That way all of the assets, risks that have been assigned to that will remain intact. So this is the user management. Now, without this being on a domain and us set up as a multi-user platform, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for us to try and run through that. Now, if you've got any queries surrounding this, obviously, providing you've got the relevant support contracts in place, we'll be happy to set up things like short screen shares to ensure that you've got it configured correctly. The next tab along on here is just an audit history for standalone users. This isn't an area that's particularly overly utilized, but for more of the multi-user platform, this just goes into a little bit more detail as to what we saw on the dashboard. So it will let you know who's logged in, when they logged in, what small changes they've made. So we can see that obviously we've been making changes to, so we scroll down here, we can see that I've been editing assets, editing owners, etc. The next tab along is license. Now, with regards to this area here, if, for example, you have purchased maybe standalone vsRisk or in fact, if you're just looking to move vsRisk from one machine to the other, the license itself is tied to an individual location. So what you would need to do is copy the license to a clipboard or just copy it outside of the tool itself, make a backup of that. So when you come to reinstall it on your new machine, it will then be moved across for you. You won't need to obviously go through contacting support and so on. If alternatively you are renewing a support license after a 12-month period, part of that renewal will then issue you a new license key where you would need to simply select on edit here and then enter in your new license key, and obviously that will keep the support and updates package running in the background for you. The next tab along on here is going to be database. Now, for multi-user, this can be we've found in the past it's designed to be relatively simple, but obviously due to the different types of environments that customers are choosing to run them in, it can at times be slightly problematic. All that you will need to ensure that preferably you have a network administrator on hand, somebody that has full admin rights to the SQL server in question, and also has that background knowledge of how to set up a database and point clients towards that location. At the top here, you'd need to enter in the server location. You'd then need to assign whether it's using Windows or SQL authentication, so obviously the username and password that is used to access that area. And then finally, once you've made that connection to the SQL location, you'll then need to enter in the database name itself, so whether you're naming it as vsRisk DB or whatever you want to call it or whatever you set it up to be. That's some way you configure all this information. Again, because we are not presenting multi-user this afternoon, it's going to be very hard to replicate it in today's webinar. But again, with the relevant support contracts in place, we'd be happy to walk you through to a certain extent. The next stage on here is going to be where you have the ability to import an existing asset register. So at the top here, at the top left, we have an Excel file, which is a relatively, it's almost empty. It just gives you the headers in the correct order in which you'll need to compile these or configure this to match to. So again, as I mentioned earlier, you do need to ensure that classifications and types, if you're using custom ones to your business, that they have already been entered into the tool under the Systems tab that we covered off just a second ago. Once you've imported it, once you've selected the Excel document you're wishing to import, simply select import and it will pull it all through into the tool. Again, it will be at this stage when you press import that a potential error message might come up letting you know of where it's failed to import. For users that are using our sample company as their building block, so to speak, you can then choose to export either your own asset registry if you actually are using your own and you want to just keep a backup of it, or if you are using the, sorry, bear me 2 seconds, I think we just had a audio issue. Okay, no, that's fine. Or if you are wishing to use this as a sample company, you can then just export this, make your modifications to it. Obviously, all the headers are going to remain in place, and then you can re-import that to then customize the newly copied sample company. The next stage on here doesn't really need much introduction, but it is something we would strongly recommend you do once in a while, is simply just to keep a backup of your database. This is more relevant to standalone users where that database is stored locally on the machine. For users that are using multi-user and therefore the location is going to be stored on that SQL server, this isn't something you're going to be utilizing too often. Another purpose of this is going back to that scenario of moving it from one machine to another, create a backup. It creates a backup of the entire ISMS, or in fact database in total, and that includes multiple ISMSs within that database. Move it across to the new machine. Once vsRisk has been reinstalled, simply come in here, restore, and it will make your vsRisk look and feel exactly as it was beforehand. Now, additional areas that you can expand upon other than just importing your own assets in bulk, you can add to the threats and vulnerabilities list that we already have built into vsRisk. So whilst we have the standardized ones over here, so the air conditioning failure one that we used earlier, you can add in your own ones if you wanted to. You'll be asked to give it its title and then its description. We can do the same for vulnerabilities. And then finally, if you have your own internal control sets or your own internal frameworks for controls, they can also be added into the system as well. Now, something key to note here is when you go to add a new control, the framework it will actually name this as is ISM. It's just the way that vsRisk will differentiate it from any of the pre-existing control sets within vsRisk. Once you've selected on the plus button, you can then give it its referencing, so how that fits in with your own referencing system in your organization, your title, and then finally the description. Once all that's been set up, when you go through into running the risk assessment, you'll be able to select from your own controls. You can toggle it on or off under the settings menu, if you recall, where you could choose which control sets you want available to you, and then also going all the way back to the control review selection, where you could set whether it's a business requirement, statutory requirement, and so on. Where we had that drop down of the 8 control sets, you'll then see another one on there known as ISM, and then that's your own personalized framework. The next tab on here is something that we mentioned earlier on in our presentation slides, is synchronization. So this is where it's going to tie in directly to our CyberComply portal. So the CyberComply portal, for users that aren't aware of this, is the other side of Vigilant Software. It's where we have 2 of our other products. We have our data flow mapping tool to help you with Article 30 of the EU GDPR, and then we also have the Compliance Manager, which is essentially an online database for EU GDPR regulations, UK laws, and then also the ISO 27001 control sets. Basically, what that will do is the API key that this will create free of charge. It doesn't cost anything on top of the initial purchase. It ties into CyberComply, so whenever there are modifications to control sets, if we add new control sets and so on, that will then automatically be pulled down into vsRisk. On that note, that is why it is strongly, well, it's not strongly suggested, it is a requirement of vsRisk that you will need to ensure that it is installed on a machine that has access to the outside internet, so there's no firewall restrictions that are blocking it from either pinging our licensing service or going through to the API key. If you do come into an issue like that, we may require the log file, which is stored typically under your primary drive on your laptop or PC, and then if you send that over to us, we can decipher what's caused the issue and let you know what might be the resolution your side. Finally, the last section on here, it's just the ending page that we're going to come to today, is the About section. The only reason we would really ask you to come in here is to find out the build number if we need that for either bug tracking or any other cases. Alternatively, you can then come into our support page, where we will have the help and support section, so our FAQ pages where we've uploaded some video tutorials to help you get to grips with using the platform, and then finally we have our contact information as well. Now, with regards to support, just to set that level of expectation to either people looking to purchase the tool or people that already own it, obviously we do sell a support package. Whilst vsRisk as a platform will always include support to some degree, having that support package includes access to any of our latest builds of vsRisk, whether it's sent from us in support here or if it's sent directly down to your machine using the tool itself. That will also give you a priority access, so we will always try our best to come back to you within a 24-hour period as per the contract agreement with you. We will keep you informed if there's any changes to that sort of time frame, and with regards to the purchase without support, then obviously you will tend to be pointed more towards the FAQ pages, or just to simply expect a slightly longer time in coming back to you. But that is, in essence, or in short, the end of today's training webinar. Whilst these are relatively similar to the demonstrations that some of you may have been on previously, we do try to go into a little bit more detail where possible, but obviously without being on a real life environment, maybe on obviously your site or someone. It's very hard for us to replicate exactly every scenario that you may wish to go through. So on that note, what we're going to do now is we're going to move on into the Q&A section. So we're going to switch back to our slides here, and we'll just leave this on the screen for now. So we're going to go through and cover off any questions that have been given throughout the demonstration this afternoon. Obviously, if there's something you think of afterwards, please do contact us either directly through the support channels or pop them into here. Anything that comes through on these webinars, we run an export on us so we can keep track of who's asked what, so we can always come back to you after the webinar as well. As I mentioned at the very beginning, just to recap, you will be sent the entire recording for this. So again, if you do have any questions, if you're happy for them to be read out, we'll be reading them out loud. That way, obviously, anybody else that is wishing to know a little bit more information will obviously hear the question, not just the answer that I'll be giving. and obviously that will be available on the recorded edition as well. The pack that we mentioned will also then be sent out separately, so then we'll have the recording which will be sent to you. It's also available on our YouTube channel as well, and then there'll be some other documents in there that you can reference should you need them. But again, what I'd like to do now is thank you all for your time this afternoon. I hope it's given some of you more of an insight into vsRisk. For any of those that have got a little bit more of a niche query regarding the usability of the tool or setup in your own environments, please do contact us through the relevant support channels, and we'll do our best to set up either screen shares with those relevant support contracts in place, or offer assistance where we best can. So thank you very much. I'm going to pop myself on mute now. Obviously, any questions that come through, I'll unmute myself so I can cover them off. But again, thank you very much for your time. We'll be in touch very shortly. Thank you.